Bush claimed a mandate, yet it was a claim that fell on deaf ears. So too with Rove's legislative agenda and the highly partisan way in which it was pursued. After all, Bush's 53% approval rating right after the election was the lowest that Gallup had ever recorded after an election for a recently re-elected president since it began polling. Social Security and immigration reform were moved to the front burner, but opposition prevailed. Renewal of the No Child Left Behind Act was mired in disagreement. In fact, to date, no compromise on its renewal remains in sight. Strategic mistakes were made. The response to Hurricane Katrina, the nomination of Harriet Miers to the Supreme Court, the Dubai ports deal. On the positive side, and let us remember that there was a positive side, at least from the administration's perspective, Bush did succeed in gaining extension of some of his tax cuts, although not the permanent ones that he wanted. Roberts and Alito were successfully confirmed to the Supreme Court. Congress eventually passed a compromise bill on FISA phone tapping, and it gave the administration what it wanted in a bill responding to the court's objections to the military tribunals proposed for trying detainees. The Supreme Court, however, had a different and final say on that matter in the Boumediene decision of this year. The administration was successful, especially in thwarting Democratic efforts to set a deadline for troop withdrawals in Iraq. Moreover, Bush's increasing use of his veto power following the Democratic takeover of Congress in the 2000 midterms proved a useful weapon for blocking Democratic initiatives. But at most, it was defensive armament. Perhaps the best that can be said is that if the Bush agenda had little positive traction in its own right, the White House was adept enough at forestalling the emergence of a Democratic alternative. The judgment of time and the Bush legacy. How then to understand the Bush presidency? George Bush's own words with which we began provide, I think, one set of important clues. Let us recall them. Quote, "I am the kind of person who trusts people. I empower people. I am firm with people. I am a decider. I do not agonize. I think, I listen, I trust my instincts, and I trust the advisors I get. I'm an accessible person." End quote. They surely worked, but only at times, as a decision-making and a managerial coda. The transition, the early presidency, and the response to 9/11 most notably attest to this. But measured against the full range of internal time of the Bush presidency and the crises besetting this administration, clearly more is needed. They need to be filled out. Adaptation must be added. Learning behavior, particularly from mistakes, is required. Accountability must accompany trust. Presidential steps to make sure that those empowered are up to the task must be taken. Resoluteness is advantageous, but the presidential choice underlying it must be based on good analysis and sound information. Presidential instincts may be right in the end, but they must be checked, at least, by the reality testing of others. Accessibility must be real, no bubbles, no insularity, no isolation. But in the long run, Does all or any of this ultimately matter? In the end, is it perhaps too bold or simplistic to suggest that presidencies ultimately stand or fall on two things: the economy and war? As for war, immediate political time is often unkind to even the best of war leaders. Although not a U.S. president, the greatest of all, Winston Churchill, and his fate is the best testimony here. But history takes in a broader sweep and ultimately judges by results, not by the character of deliberative processes, nor immediate popularity. For George W. Bush, it would be Iraq in the end. And here we perhaps come full circle. Bush's own stubbornness in seeking something approximating victory, rather than a stalemate or the sort of face-saving exit recommended by the bipartisan Baker-Hamilton Commission, remember them, led him to significantly increase the size of U.S. forces in Iraq and direct it towards a more aggressive counterinsurgency strategy, the so-called surge of 2007-2008. Largely devised by NSC advisor Stephen Hadley and his staff, rather than the generals at the Pentagon who mostly preferred the status quo. The change in strategy was the result of a more careful vetting process than had occurred in the earlier decision to go to war. Or at least that seems to be the case. Discontent with the progress of the war led to greater consultation with outside experts on counterinsurgency, with retired military officers, as well as a more thorough interagency review process. Although advice was mixed, in the end, the President and the President alone decided a major effort was called for. The effort was also undoubtedly aided by the appointment of Major General David Petraeus, an expert on counterinsurgency and an advocate for a new strategy, as the new field commander in Iraq. Petraeus' efforts seemed to pay off. Increased cooperation with the Sunnis and their increasing hostility to local al-Qaeda forces, the so-called Sunni awakening, boded well. The surge proved politically controversial, yet as months passed, violence seemed to decrease in Iraq. Whether the surge will lead to a peaceful and democratic Iraq still remains an open question. Time shall tell, as it always does. But if the surge does mark a turn towards success, it will in all likelihood be judged a significant point in the evolution of this presidency and one of the most important legacies of a determined wartime president. Did the Bush operational coda finally serve him well? As for the economy, severe difficulties clearly developed at the end of this presidency. As 2008 wore on, the administration faced, as we all did, rising oil prices, and most importantly, a serious crisis with defaulting home mortgages. This has led to instability in the financial sector unprecedented since the Great Depression. The country also faced, and continues to face, an unstable and eventually declining stock market and the onset of what may well be a severe recession. These numbers are staggering. Deficits skyrocketed from $162 billion in 2007 to $485 billion this past fiscal year, to a projected $1 trillion this current fiscal year. And that may be a conservative estimate. It was a context, and is a context, that called for renewed presidential leadership. But was the White House and George W. Bush equipped to handle it?